Well, good morning, Brooklyn. I'm Ann Oliveira, Senior Vice President and New York Retail Market Executive for Investors Bank, and your Board Chair of the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of my team at Investors Bank and our Executive Committee, our member Board of Directors, and our amazing team at the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce, I welcome everyone this morning to our 2021 Not-for-Profit Summit. This past year and a half has been a difficult time for not-for-profits, with many challenges that were brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. With so many social distancing measures in effect, not-for-profits were forced to reevaluate the way they interacted with their donors, their staff, volunteers, and the broader communities that they serve. Today, not-for-profit organizations are reflecting back at this time and on the challenges they faced, as well as many of the obstacles that they've conquered, helping them identify plans of action and opportunities for their future success. There's one thing that is for sure, and that this pandemic forced many of us to do, was to learn how to do more with less in order to continue on with our missions. This morning, we are fortunate to have several experts in the not-for-profit world that will provide us with information around philanthropy and social justice. I would like to thank our keynote speaker and longtime chamber friend and supporter, Gregg, who is the Executive Director of the Joseph and Clara Ty Foundation. I'd also like to take a minute to thank our amazing panel of experts. Seneca, Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President of Brick Arts Media. Wayne Ho, President and CEO of the Chinese American Planning Council. Marcella J. Tillett, Vice President of the Brooklyn Community Foundation. And last but definitely not least, our friend Lisette Nieves, President of the Fund for the City of New York. Let me take my chamber hat off for a second and put on my Investors Bank hat. Investors Bank is proud to continue with our support of the Brooklyn Chamber initiatives, and especially events like this annual Not-for-Profit Summit. This is our 10th, I believe it's our 10th actual summit that we have partnered with Brooklyn since we came in. We believe that providing education and updates that impact not-for-profits that are providing so many programs and services to the communities in which we serve at Investors Bank is crucial in our responsibility as good corporate citizens. Now, it was 10 years ago that we were opening our first branch in New York, and of course, it was in Brooklyn. Today, 10 years later, we have 47 branches throughout New York and 19 of those offices right here in the borough of Brooklyn. We are committed to the not-for-profits making a difference in Brooklyn, and we are committed to assisting not only through our Investors Bank Charitable Foundation, but also with our banking experience as well. Shortly, you will hear more about Investors Bank and about our philanthropic efforts from Jennifer Smith, our Community Development Officer in New York, as well as from our great leader, our Chairman and CEO of Investors Bank, Kevin Cummings. I thank the Brooklyn Chamber for their partnership, support, and friendship over the past 10 years. And I need to take a moment to mention how proud I am of the extraordinary work that the Brooklyn Chamber has been doing, led by our President and CEO, Randy Pierce. When I look back at this past year, I can't help be grateful to be part of an organization that is truly making an impact and a difference. The advocacy and the relentless outreach has really made an impact to our not-for-profits and throughout the Brooklyn business community. I applaud Randy for his solid leadership and the entire staff for their outstanding hard work and dedication to the businesses in our community during such challenging times. I do hope you all enjoy our program this morning, and thank you again for joining us for our 2021 Not-for-Profit Summit. Now I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer Smith, our Community Development Officer at Investors Bank. Jennifer?
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, everyone. I am Jennifer Smith, the Community Development Officer of Investors Bank New York, and today I have the great pleasure of introducing our Chairman and CEO, Kevin Cummings. It has truly been an incredible 10 years working with Randy Pierce, Lori Rayfield, and the entire Brooklyn Chamber amazing team. And today's program promises to be the absolute best yet. As Community Development Officer, I lead our local New York partnerships with community-based not-for-profit organizations. Our work includes extensive employee volunteering, community grants made to grassroots organizations from the Investors Bank Charitable Foundation, and our Care to Share Affinity program, which is a banking program that we are proud to offer to nonprofit organizations. Our footprint extends from the 5 boroughs all the way out to Southampton and Long Island. And Kevin Cummings, our Investors Bank's chairman and CEO, truly always leads by example. Kevin sits on the board of trustees of the Scholarship Fund for Inner City Children and the board of trustees at St. Benedict's Preparatory School. Kevin is also a member of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York and the Community Foundation of New Jersey. Kevin, thank you so much. Your support of nonprofits here in New York and the Brooklyn Chamber truly means so much. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, and thanks, Jen, for that very kind introduction. And as you know, you're the boots on the ground. You're doing all the hard work in New York, and you're the face of the bank for many in attendance today. And I appreciate all that you do, helping these not-for-profits. I also want to give a shout out to Anna, our New York market exec. I have had the good fortune of working with Anna for over 10 years, and she is certainly responsible for a lot of the expansion that we've had in the greater New York market. She's a valued member of our bank leadership team, and I thank you, Anna, for everything you've done. It's been said that true leaders don't rise to the top by chance, but instead through purpose and service to others. They lead by example because they understand that people do what they see and not what they hear. And that certainly describes Anna. We used to host this event at St. Francis, and St. Francis has a great quote. He says, "Let your sermons be said without words." And I think Anna certainly lives by that motto. She not only strives to make a difference, a real difference for our customers, but she also takes the time to give back to the communities we serve. She rarely turns down a chance to volunteer her time in support of a good cause or certainly a not-for-profit. And speaking of outstanding organizations, as many of you already know, she also lends her time and talents to the Brooklyn Chamber, serving as its chairman. And it's an honor for us to once again partner with the Chamber and sponsor this event. While it's unfortunate we can't be together today, I thank you all for taking the time from your busy schedules to join this summit. And I would be remiss for not taking a moment to salute Randy Pierce. Randy, I thank you for your leadership. I think Brooklyn is one of the largest chambers in the country, and I appreciate all the hard work, especially during these times, that your team puts in and day out to make your chamber special, but also to make this summit happen every year. These last 18 months have been anything but ordinary. Actually, I had hair at the beginning of the 18 months. The pandemic has upended our way of life, and it has tested organizations and individuals all around the world. And it has really put the nonprofit sector under increased pressure to answer the increasing needs for assistance throughout our communities. As I've said at the not-for-profit conference over here in New Jersey last month, there's battle fatigue, and that battle fatigue is real. At our bank, we recognize that you are change makers who are tackling these huge challenges as part of your daily work. And it's hard work. Change is difficult, make no mistake about it. It takes time, effort, commitment, and resources. And even in the best of times, we know that operating in the nonprofit space is never easy. Although it fits the cliche, and it's so true, especially with all of you, nothing in this life is worth doing that is ever easy. It's the hard stuff that matters. If it doesn't hurt, you're not doing enough. And doing the hard stuff is what makes your organizations significant and great. All of you are the heart of your communities. And I often say our proverbial boots on the ground. At Investors, we're all about service to our communities. Actually, it's part of our DNA. We believe to do well, you have to do right. And we're on a journey from success to significance. And we aim for significance because we want to leave behind a purpose and a legacy of service to others. Any corporation can make money. It's the corporation that serves the community, is a good corporate citizen. We are committed to making that meaningful difference for our customers, our employees, and the communities that we serve. And it's why we're passionate about supporting the great work your organizations are doing. Last year alone, the bank and the foundation contributed nearly $4 million to over 600 not-for-profits in our community and in our service area. However, just writing a check isn't enough. At Investors, we aim to do much more. And it's that spirit of volunteerism, as shown by Anna and Jennifer, that is alive and well throughout our bank. You see it in our team there in Brooklyn. It's not just writing a check, it's time, treasure, and talent. And that team is out there making a difference with their neighbors and where they live and work. And I'll take a quote from the Reverend Martin Luther King. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? You know, the golden rule of banking, I got the gold, I make the rule. We don't live by that rule at Investors. We live by the real golden rule. Treat people the way you want to be treated. And the answer is simple. We must strive to be of service to others. It's our call to action, a call that everyone here is answering every day in your daily lives. Today, the Chamber has put together a terrific program. We are joined by a noteworthy panel and a keynote speaker from the nonprofit world. He will address the current conversations around philanthropy and social justice. It's a great program, and I thank all the participants for their time today. Again, to all of you out there in the virtual landscape, I thank you all for coming today. And I hope you leave today with inspiration, hope, and optimism for the future. And maybe get some great ideas on how you can help your organization achieve your goals and aspirations. Thank you for your time, and have a great summit.
Well, good morning, Brooklyn. Welcome to the Brooklyn Chamber's annual Not-for-Profit Summit, hopefully our last virtual signature event. I am Randy Piers, I'm the President and CEO, and I'm both honored and blessed to serve in this capacity and serve all of you. I want to thank our presenting sponsor once again, Investors Bank. Thank you, Kevin. And of course, our board chair, Anna Oliveira, not just for her work that she does with the bank, but also her volunteer work here at the Chamber. She is a leader. She has been my partner throughout this journey, and I'm very, very grateful for that support. The last couple of years have been challenging for the not-for-profit community in many ways. Even before the COVID-19 crisis, nonprofits had experienced changes in their funder expectations, inconsistent support from government, and increasing demand for services across the board. When you put the COVID crisis into the mix and the inability to hold in-person events, or sometimes even provide services in person, many of our nonprofits found themselves under-resourced and in a position to have to make staffing and service cuts and seeking guidance on how to remain viable in today's environment. Yet the not-for-profit sector in Brooklyn and across New York City remains one of the largest and most important sectors of our economy, especially from an employment perspective. The program today will focus on a newer shift in philanthropy, the long overdue movement towards social justice and equity. This conversation over the last year and a half has been inextricably tied to the impacts of the pandemic, which exposed even deeper challenges across our city in truly promoting and advancing equity. The good news is that many corporations and foundations are changing their philanthropic model and pivoting their giving to ensure that impact is measured through a social justice lens. Our distinguished panelists represent the not-for-profit sector space in media, the arts, social services, and capacity building, and have a wealth of knowledge to impart on how best to position your organization to continue to serve the constituencies you represent. Now, at this time, I am pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, my good friend, Gregg Bishop. Gregg has made a name for himself investing in low to moderate income communities, growing the capacity of small and medium-sized enterprises, and implementing sectoral workforce strategies while building resilient technology infrastructures across media companies. He is currently the executive director of the Social Justice Fund, an initiative funded by the Joe and Clara Sy Foundation. The Social Justice Fund centers its work around racial justice and economic mobility for BIPOC populations throughout Brooklyn. Before this role, he served as the interim executive director of Coro New York, an organization that believes in meaningful change and collaboration. Gregg, over the last 13 years, had experience in government, serving first under Mayor Michael Bloomberg and then under Mayor de Blasio. From 2015 to 2020, he served as the commissioner of the New York City Department of Small Business Services, where he was charged with running a dynamic city agency focused on equity and opportunity, leading to economic self-sufficiency and mobility for the New York's diverse communities. During his tenure, he connected small businesses to over 200 million in capital, certified over 9,000 MWBE firms, connected over 100,000 New Yorkers to good-paying jobs, and invested over 10 million in capacity building programs across the 5 boroughs. Gregg has a strong track record in the not-for-profit and in the private sectors. He served as senior manager for workforce development at NPower, where he was responsible for doubling the capacity of the Technology Service Corps and a nationally recognized technology training program for young adults ages 18 to 25. Born in Grenada and raised in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, Gregg received his master's degree in integrated marketing and management communications from Florida State University and graduated magna cum laude with a BS in business administration from Florida A&M University. He studied international management and marketing in Tokyo, Japan, and he is a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School's Senior Executives in State and Local Governments program and the Choral Leadership program. He is also an adjunct professor at Baruch College's School of Public Affairs and serves on several boards. He's a good friend, he's a fellow servant leader, and I have the highest degree of respect for him. So I turn it over to our keynote speaker, Gregg Bishop.
Well, thank you, Randy, for that wonderful introduction. And of course, it's so good to be here. And good morning, Brooklyn. I'm sort of humbled to be in front of you because when you heard my bio, I was sort of like, wow, I guess I started working when I was 13 because it just means that I'm getting older. But I'm really excited to be here. Randy talked a lot about the work that I've done in my career. And I've got to tell you that, being in front of this audience is important because I could not have accomplished the work that I've done without opportunities being created for me. And most of those opportunities were created by either specific, initiatives funded by philanthropy or by nonprofits working in my community. And so one of the things that I wanted to just talk a little bit about is what we're doing at the Social Justice Fund, but in more broadly, like what is this thing that we just talked about in terms of like what is social justice philanthropy? As you probably everyone in the audience knows, last year was a difficult year for many reasons. Kevin alluded to it. The pandemic has and still continues to ravage our nations. We just recently lost Colin Powell. Even individuals I know personally has succumbed to the virus. So we know that the pandemic is still impacting communities. But one of the things that we have seen is that it's impacted communities of color more disproportionately than other communities. And so we have also saw a reckoning in terms of our country's response to the murder of George Floyd. And as most of my colleagues here on the panel, Lisette, Wayne, it's good to see you. Like I know that a lot of organizations and companies rose to the challenge as individuals were marching for racial justice. And I'll talk about the difference between racial equity and racial justice, and made pledges. But one of the things that we're now seeing is that those pledges are not actually manifesting, or those pledges were performative. And so some of the things I'm going to touch on today, and with the time that I have, is, just in this sector. And mind you, and I just want to be clear, and I know Anna said we're going to hear from experts. I'm not an expert. I'm just here to talk about the facts. I know what it's like to be, an ED at a nonprofit, and to wait on the city to pay off, pay on the contract, and to float dollars, and to do more with less. So I have that experience. But step into the philanthropic world. It is definitely, I am coming from multiple angles, including being one of, at one point in time, I was the board chair of Red Hook Initiative and dealing with the philanthropic industry. And in some cases, and I'm very plain spoken, in some cases, it wasn't really a good experience. And so some of the things that I'm bringing now to this role is to ensure that we, on the philanthropic side, we are accountable to you, the individuals who are doing the work on the ground, but then also some of the things I'm going to talk about, the work that you are doing, how it could help us. So there's about, in the time I have, there's like 6 areas that I wanted to touch on. One is, what is this thing called, social justice philanthropy? And I want to talk about, what the focus should be, what the impact should be. Some of the values that we should have, some of the tools that we should use in terms of grant making, and just how we can actually become a catalyst. So let's start with, us. And when I say us, meaning just the philanthropic organizations need to be more accessible and diverse. One of the things in just preparing for this conversation, 6 cents of every philanthropic dollar awarded in 2018, and this was a recent article in Nonprofit Quarterly, 6 cents went to racial equity, and only a penny went to racial justice. And the article had a great analogy in terms of what racial equity and racial justice means. Racial equity is really just confronting the problem at hand. And I'm going to use a simple analogy in terms of what the article talked about, is that if you're in a boat, the boat is leaking, you're just scooping out the water, right? But you're not dealing with the systemic issue, which is there's a hole in the boat, right? And that is exactly what racial justice talks about. Racial justice really focuses on the systemic issue, right? What are we doing to actually change the system, right? When you look at some of the challenges that we saw with COVID, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, there's a reason why when you see individuals who did not have an option to work from home, there was a lot of individuals, a lot of organizations who are working to help those workers. But there is a systemic issue in terms of like why they didn't have an option to work from home, whether it's lack of bandwidth, right? Or whether it's the type of industry that they were in. A lot of folks were in the hospitality industry. Well, why are they in the hospitality industry, right? So there's a number of reasons why we need to focus on the systemic issues. So one of the things that we did at the Social Justice Fund was look at what can we do at the onset. For those who don't know, the Social Justice Fund, as Randy alluded to, was created and literally as a result of the racial justice protests that Joe and Clara Sy saw originating right actually at the plaza at the Barclays Center. And there was a commitment not only to fund the work that we're doing right now, which is to focus on racial justice and economic mobility in Brooklyn. It was a $50 million commitment over the next 10 years. And a lot of the work that we did originally, and Clara actually sat down with a number of individuals, even on this call, to listen and understand what are the things that we need to focus on. And what we focus on, and Randy, Lisette, and I were part of those conversations, were the systemic issues that we were seeing. So we have a focus on BIPOC businesses. And of course, we wanted to get capital to BIPOC businesses. But it's not just about getting the capital to BIPOC businesses. It's about addressing the systemic issue, which is most of our capital markets. And when you think about when you're looking to get a loan, you're asked for collateral, you're asked for a guarantor. Well, these things, when you ask for those things, whether you know it or not, you're perpetrating some systemic issues, right? Which is in individuals, especially in communities of color, because of redlining, there may be a lack of collateral because there isn't the access to like home ownership, right? And that was like government driven, right? Or if you ask for a guarantor, you're asking a community that has been that did not have the opportunity to build wealth to then back each other, right? So you're sort of perpetrating those systemic issues. So what we did was create a program that focused on character. And so those little things, when you actually look at the systemic issue, you want to actually focus on what is the true root of the problem. Now, we don't know what the outcomes will be, right? We have to measure and evaluate this program. But the goal is really to focus on the systemic issue and say, like, if the system, meaning the financial markets, needs to have collateral or a guarantor to reduce risk, can we innovate a way to actually reduce that risk in another way? So when we talk about addressing systemic issues, those are the things we're talking about. So if there's food insecurity, what is the systemic reason for that food insecurity? If there's health insecurity, what is the systemic reason for that health insecurity? If there's education insecurity, what is the systemic reason for that? And that leads me to the next part that I wanted to talk about, which is you won't know the answers to those questions unless you include the people who are impacted by those injustices. You have to, and this goes even for the nonprofits here, you have to have boots on the ground. The reason why, and I know, Randy, we're not talking a lot about the Brooklyn Chamber here. We're talking about globally, but literally the reason why we partnered with the Brooklyn Chamber to run this program was because they had boots on the ground. They were interacting with the businesses to actually understand what the challenges are. So if you are in philanthropy, you want to actually partner with a nonprofit that has boots on the ground, that understands the communities that they're dealing with. And if you're a nonprofit, you have to be accessible. You have to go out in the community. You have to understand, like, what are the issues that are plaguing your community, and use that information to then influence and shape what the intervention will be, because we want to make sure that we are addressing systemic issues. And of course, one of the things that, and I've seen some other foundations work in this particular capacity, is in order to make that happen, foundations need to be more accessible and more diverse. And there's a number of ways you can do that. One of the things that I've in preparing for this, and I saw, 10% of foundation board members are people of color, only 10%. And when you think about family foundations, their board members, it's only 2.2%. So when you are looking at systemic challenges, you need to have access to individuals who understand, like, what exactly is the challenge here. You need to have people who have the cultural competence. You need to be able to, and so if you are a foundation and your board does not reflect the diversity of the community that you're operating in, you actually need to figure out how to solve that problem. It's the same thing if you are a nonprofit. Now, everything is intertwined, because I know there's a number of nonprofits who are desperately seeking to diversify their boards. But then it comes down to, well, who can fundraise, right? But then when you put that fundraising sort of like umbrella over a lens on who you're actually bringing to your board, then you're going to end up with perpetrating the systemic issue, right? Where you have individuals who probably can make contributions in other ways, but because the focus is on fundraising, then you're sort of pushing that systemic issue, which is individuals, especially individuals coming from underrepresented communities, may not have the access, the social access, the capital access to actually meet your give-get. So this all is intertwined in terms of like how we can actually make a big difference. And one of the things that, foundations are doing, and I want to commend, for example, Robinhood in their Power Fund is investing in organizations that are led by BIPOC individuals, because that relieves the pressure on that executive director to focus a lot on fundraising And instead, it's building the capacity of not only that executive director to figure out different ways to fundraise, introduce that executive director to different communities and different social networks, but it's also investing in that particular individual. So those are sort of like the innovative ways that in the foundation world can actually make a true difference, because then you're changing the narrative. You're focused on a lot on the systemic issues. Another area that we need to talk about is transparency in grant making. And one of the things, and I know there's a number of nonprofits that's probably saying yes, right? It's literally like the grant making process should not be onerous. It should not be, one of those things where you need to hire a whole team in order to like meet the objectives of the grantor. And that is one of the things that I've seen in the past, as I said, I've worked in nonprofits before, is, how do we make it a relationship, right? And one of the things that we need to do, and, full transparency, I'm on the board of the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation, is this sort of concept of trust-based philanthropy. You are, and for the nonprofits in the room, you are the experts on the ground. And it should be a partnership. It should not be the grantor is telling you what to do. But also conversely, if it is not a match in terms of the goals of the grantor, you as the grantee should not alter your mission just to chase the dollars. We need to make sure that it is a good relationship. And one of the things that I know a number of foundations are doing is to try to make the process as easy as possible, meaning not restricting the dollars to just a particular program, to give in general operating dollars, not having onerous reporting requirements, or working together to build a program. So one of the things that we have started to do, and think of the Social Justice Fund as a very new organization, is we are working with partners, and we are working with partners to understand the problem. We're working with problems to build the solution. So we are working to sort of innovate. And that is the focus that we are doing. There are other organizations who totally understand that we just want you to continue doing what you're doing. So every organization has its focus and its mission. And one of the things that, as nonprofits, is finding the right match and finding the right organization that's aligned with what you are doing. And for the folks in the room who are the grantors, ensuring that your process is not onerous to the point where a nonprofit is spending more time reporting back to you than actually doing the work that they're doing. The other part, and there's two other things that I wanted to touch on, was just connecting that to that social network. And I alluded to it earlier, which is, one of the things as philanthropic organizations you can do is that if there isn't a match in terms of the programming, what can you do to connect that nonprofit leader to your social network? What can you do to introduce that nonprofit leader to other organizations in your network that could possibly be a match? One of the things that I've seen, and one of the things that has worked really well, is understanding, what is it that this nonprofit is trying to do, and then really working with that executive director to introduce that executive director to others in your social network. What that does, it actually increases the network that executive director has. And in particular communities, that is so important because it helps build the capacity. Again, I go back to what some of the work that Robert is doing, some of the work that the Robert Sterling Clark is doing, is just simply bringing executive directors into the room to talk about some of the challenges that they have is so powerful, because now those executive directors know that they are not alone. So those are some of the things that not only can you as funders do, but as nonprofits, you can expect from your grantor's relationship. And then, of course, the last part is just as in terms of just thinking through of what is, when we talk about this social justice philanthropy, there are many foundations out there, and there are many organizations who are looking to do the good work. And some of them have some endowments that are tremendous. And one of the things, and a number of things that you can do, is just using your assets to serve as catalysts. So, for example, you can actually, when you think about, for example, in the financial sector, we have Black-owned banks who are struggling with capital. And there are some foundations that have, dollars that could be invested in those Black-owned banks and just hold it, just simply opening up an account, for example. Or you can even push the envelope further and actually encourage those banks. One of the things when I was a commissioner I was shocked about was, for example, for those who understand Brooklyn, in Brownsville, there are only 2 banks in Brownsville, literally. I believe it's one major bank and actually 2 major banks. And those banks are there because I think there's a state program that encouraged one to be there. And the other is there, I think, because there just isn't any other banks in the community. But when you think about that, right, now, how does that translate? Well, now you have a community that's unbanked, right? A community that now depends on these payroll lenders to actually, when they get paid, they're going there, they're paying to get their paycheck. They don't have a savings account. Those businesses don't have a business account. And therefore, those are the sort of the what causes some of the imbalances that we've seen. For example, with the PPP loans, where there was a lot of Black-owned businesses that were not eligible because they didn't have a business account. They only had a personal account. So using that as an example, as in philanthropy, and for those that with huge endowments, working with the financial sector to figure out, like, well, what is it going to take for you to open up a branch in this particular community? And I know for the bankers in the room, you're sort of thinking, well, we need a guarantee of deposits, right? Because we are not in philanthropy. We have to make money. And so there is a conversation that needs to be had in terms of, well, if we as a philanthropic organization guarantee like a certain deposit amount, or we all get together and guarantee a certain, will you open up a branch in this particular area? Because then that will address other issues. So that is just one way of like using your assets to serve as a catalyst. You could also think about one of the things that we're doing, and I'm encouraging everyone, this is like an open invitation. On Saturday, we are actually celebrating the unveiling of an art installation at the Broccoli Center Plaza. And art and social justice interact. But one of the things that we're doing is we have contracted the restaurants. So think of like a Taste of Brooklyn. If the restaurants that we have helped with our loan program will be present at the plaza, offering free tastings of their menu. But we are also connecting them to our supplier diversity program. So using the assets that we have, which is the arena, and connecting those programs to the programs that we're helping, we are advancing not just helping those businesses with capital, but then also helping them with other areas, in such as marketing, helping them figure out their growth strategy. So when you are thinking as a philanthropic organization, what can you do? Well, if you are making grants to other organizations, bringing those organizations together, figuring out if there's a way that the individuals that are being helped from one organization can benefit from the work that another organization is doing. Those are all ways that we can actually connect the dots in this ecosystem. So finally, and I just want to make sure I'm not running over time, but one of the things that I did want to just challenge the grantees, because I've talked a lot about grantors, because that's now my world. But as grantees, again, encourage you to be on the ground. There's no better way of saying it that you are the experts. Having the boots on the ground is important to us. Being able to understand like what are the challenges. And the only way we can be effective is if we have the right data from you. So being as open as possible to connecting to the community is so important. And then, of course, holding us accountable. This sector itself, as I said, I've dealt with funders in the past. Some have been really good, some hasn't. And I've been vocal about it. And so you also should be vocal. if there are things that you are seeing, one of the biggest things I have and will continue to advocate for is really coming together and advocating. You are only as good as the whole, right? So obviously working together with other nonprofit organizations, figuring out the ways to actually get feedback to the grantors is so important because sometimes they may not know that the work that they're putting you through is onerous and it's causing problems. So just holding the industry accountable, and then also, and I would say this for me, the corporate folks on this conference, is that you cannot be performative. So if you're making a pledge of addressing systemic issues, and you're saying it's you're making a $10 million commitment, like 9 million of those dollars can't be work that you've already done or already committed, and you're just rehashing. And maybe that's a conversation that you need to have with your communications folks, because I know everyone loves announcements. But what we have seen in the past is that corporations are making these announcements, but then when you peel back the onion, it's really just a spend that's already been committed, and they're just rehashing that. So try not to be as performative as we've seen in the past. And for the grantees from the nonprofits room, being able to call that out is important. And then, of course, the last thing is be innovative. Try new things. Again, change is always different, but I want to caution, and I mentioned this earlier, is do not change your mission because there's funding available for something else. That is a strategy that will fail. Stay true to what you believe in, but definitely there are innovative ways to continue doing your mission, but doing it in a different way. And that's important, not only for you as the organization, but also for the grantors. Those are the things at the Social Justice Fund we are looking at. We're looking for innovation. We're like at the edge of the frontier to look at innovation to address systemic issues. And I know there are a number of organizations who are doing the same thing. So with that, I just want to close by saying thank you very much to Randy and the Brooklyn Chamber team. This is such an important conversation at this time, especially at this time. And I do want to thank my partners, my friends in the room. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion, and to all the nonprofits in the room. Continue doing the work that you're doing. One of the things, one last story, I was in City Hall, and we were talking about the violence that was plaguing Chicago. And the mayor asked a room full of nonprofit experts. It was nonprofit and others. We have been blessed to not see the level. I mean, we still have violence, but not the level of violence that Chicago had. And one of the things that someone in the room said is that it's because of the nonprofit industry. New York City has been blessed with so many nonprofit organizations. Now, I will tell you the truth. You are filling in the gap for where the city is actually failing. And in some cases, you are carrying financially, literally on your balance sheet, the work that the city should be doing. But this is where like the private, the public, and the nonprofit sector all needs to come together and continue just making the city the best city it is. And that's the work that we will be doing at the Social Justice Fund. Our focus is really just Brooklyn, but we will definitely, work with partners to create innovative ways to address systemic issues. And you, as nonprofits, should feel really, really proud of the work that you're doing, but still hold not only our sector accountable, but hold government accountable as well. So thank you very much for having me. And Randy, thank you very much, and team for this great conference.
Gregg, thank you so much. We like to say, keep it real in Brooklyn, and that's about as real as it gets in terms of the perspective, because you come from so many different perspectives over your career. And, I'm very lucky to get to work with you every day and every week and do this work together. So I really appreciate you. So thank you for all you do.
Thank you.
We will now move to the panel portion of today's program on philanthropy and social justice. Our moderator for the panel is Seneca Mudd, Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President at Brick Arts Media, a leading arts and media institution anchored in downtown Brooklyn, whose work spans contemporary visual and performing arts, media, and civic action. At Brick, Seneca leads finance, human resources, compliance, facilities, and technology, furthering Brick's leading position in the field. Prior to joining Brick, Seneca was Senior Vice President for Business Development at MDC Partners, Inc., and Vice President for Global Clients at Access, a unit of WPP. A native New Yorker and Fort Greene resident, Seneca believes the creative classes will be central to Brooklyn's return to full vitality. It is my pleasure to turn over this panel discussion to our moderator, Seneca Mudd.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Randy. I am Seneca Mudd, and I'm very happy to be with everyone today. Before we get started on the panel, I wanted to introduce our panelists of esteemed leaders within the not-for-profit sector. It is my hope that we can have a robust conversation around the issues facing the sector right now as we continue to press through this pandemic. As we go through this process, please feel free to use the comments box within Zoom to enter any questions or comments you might have so that we can keep the dialogue robust. First, allow me to introduce Lisette Nieves. She is the president of the Fund for the City of New York, an institution charged with developing and helping to implement innovations in policy, programs, practices, and technologies to improve the functioning of government, agencies, and not-for-profit organizations in New York City and beyond. Before joining FCNY, Lisette was the Director of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies and a full clinical professor at NYU Steinhardt, where she co-led the design and implementation of a doctoral program in educational leadership and innovation and taught organizational theory and behavior and educational policy analysis. Also on the panel today is Wayne Ho. He is the president and CEO of the Chinese American Planning Council, the nation's largest Asian American social services agency. In 2017, CPC launched Advancing Our Community, its organization-wide strategy to expand services to address persistent needs and emerging trends and to improve leadership skills among staff and community members. Previously, Wayne served as Chief Strategy and Program Officer for the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, an association of 200 community and faith-based member agencies aiming to promote upward mobility of underserved New Yorkers. Marcella Tillett joined the Brooklyn Community Foundation in September 2019 as the Vice President of Programs and Partnerships, overseeing the foundation's strategic grant-making and community leadership programs. She was previously the Vice President for Project Street Beat of Planned Parenthood of New York City, a unique HIV prevention, harm reduction, and access to care program. Marcella spent over a decade actively engaged in HIV prevention and access to care and sexual and reproductive justice advocacy through community planning work in New York City and nationally. Now, we're going to give each of our panelists about 3 to 4 minutes to open and articulate a perspective and set the stage from their respective positions. Again, during the forum, I welcome you to submit any questions you might have in the Zoom chat box, and we will see them here, and we'll attempt to integrate them into the conversation in real time. So let's get started, and I will pass to Lisette.
Great. Hi, good morning, everyone. What a pleasure it is to be here. First, thank you to Investors Bank and the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce for pulling this together. It's an honor to be part of this conversation. I also want to thank Gregg Bishop for his great opening remarks. A couple of things that I wanted to open with that I think are important as far as thinking about the Fund for the City of New York. The first is that when we think about the kind of entrepreneurial energy that's necessarily for recovery, we have to always include, and I'm grateful to Randy who gets this as well too, is that we also have to include the social entrepreneurs in that as well. The nonprofit leaders that we know are an important part of the economic engine for recovery. And with that said, that's important for us to get, because for us, we run one of the largest, what we call partnership organizations, which is making sure that at least 70 different nonprofits have the kind of healthcare, have the 401 support, have the financial back office that allows them to do the work that they need to do. If this is a commitment for social entrepreneurs, we should be able to have intermediaries that are able to support them. And so I want to put that there. And that's important because out of that portfolio, the majority of our leaders are BIPOC led. So that says something, right? That says something about what does it mean to be able to have a fiscal agent that's able to serve in this kind of cooperative capacity to make sure that your employees have stronger quality of lives through the benefits and other pieces. That's key. The second thing I think is important, want to think about, is that recovery is also not about loss of memory, right? So what happened in recovery? When we think about this, the reckoning that had to happen racially, the amount of anti-Asian hate that took place, what took place with thinking about police violence and African Americans and what they experienced in this country. We cannot ignore that those are conversations that nonprofits have to have with themselves as well, right? And that we need to support leaders who are able to understand those kinds of conversations. And I'm really proud that we're able to do that in ways that I would say the kind of conversations that we have around proximity would have never happened 10 years ago. And I think the last piece that I think is really important to think about the fund, one is a partnership organization, but the other is, let's just put it out there, general operating support, right? One thing we get in the sector for, when we think about for-profit entrepreneurs, is we trust leaders, we give them money, and we say, make it happen. And yet we still see this kind of onerous, I would say onerous pressure on nonprofits around restricted funds. Now, I understand to a certain point why government may have to do that, but philanthropy does not have to do that. Whenever the fund gives out a grant, it's always general operating support, right? And so I think there are ways, and I'm just making sure I won't go over time, that we kind of have these conversations around, what are even the small things that we can do that talk about systemic bias that can happen? And one, I would say, is the operational onerous pieces that happen and that we could have with intermediaries, right? I think the other piece is this one about discussions around boards and employees, right? I think the other one we could have too, and probably the last, is this piece around how do we hand out funds, right? So that we can trust people to take chances and make choices in the nonprofit sector that often don't get the chance to, that people in the for-profit sector almost take for granted that are allowed. So that's just a brief opening here. I'm excited to be part of a conversation, honored to be at this table, and thank you, Seneca.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisette. We are next going to go to Wayne Ho.
Thank you, Seneca, and thank you to the Brooklyn Chamber as well as to Investors Bank for sponsoring today's event, and great to see Gregg and Lisette and other friends on this. I've been living in Brooklyn for 17 years, so it's great to be part of this summit today. So when we talk about philanthropy and racial justice, it's important for us to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible about what racial justice means. The Asian American community has over 40 ethnic groups, over 100 language and dialect groups here in New York alone. Based on the 2020 census, the Asian American community makes up 17% of New York City, as well as 10% of New York State. 17% of New York City means that there's more Asian Americans in New York City than there are actually people in all of San Francisco and all of Rhode Island. So we need to understand that there are persistent needs in the Asian American community. And oftentimes when we've been talking about racial justice, the Asian American community feels left out. So while it was heartening for us to hear that there's more corporations and foundations willing to deal with anti-Asian hate crimes, we need to realize that there's been a history of anti-Asian hate crimes going back to the 1800s when we first immigrated to this country, and what is being done at the systemic level to make sure that there's resources going to a community. So during the pandemic, the Asian American community had unemployment go up 6,900%. That was the highest of all racial groups in New York City. But during this time, we also know that historically, government grants as well as foundation grants do not go equitably to the community. Based on research from the Asian American Federation, less than 2% of social services dollars from the city of New York goes to the Asian American community. Less than 1% of state social services contract dollars goes to the Asian American community. And it's no better in private philanthropy. Based on research from Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in philanthropy, less than 1% of philanthropic dollars goes to the Asian American community. So we need to make sure that social justice philanthropy keeps all groups included. And while I personally like that we are using new language, acknowledging BIPOC communities and Black and Brown communities, some of this terminology actually leaves out the Asian American community. So while there are, I would argue, Brown Asian Americans, South Asian communities, Southeast Asian communities, Filipinos, oftentimes the terminology that's being used is not inclusive of the community. But while I'm pushing for inclusion of the fastest growing racial group in the state and the city, we as the Asian American community also need to deal with our own anti-Blackness and anti-Brownness. So while there was a rise in anti-Asian violence, it was very challenging for us to note that we were calling for carceral solutions. Just during summer of 2020, we had Asians for Black Lives. We were marching with BLM. We were saying that mass incarceration and police brutality must stop. But then the moment in the fall and early spring, we see more violence and there's more safety issues in the Asian American community. We started saying we need more cops on the street. We want more cops to protect us. That's what safety means. Let's lock up the perpetrators. So as we move forward in this conversation today, I look forward to talking more about what we can do as nonprofit organizations, mainstream groups, grassroots organizations, as well as Asian American and other communities of color organizations to make sure we hold philanthropy accountable, but we also hold ourselves accountable. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Wayne. And now I would like to turn to Marcella to share some thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce and join my esteemed co-panelists. I, as mentioned, am Marcella Tillett, Vice President of Programs and Partnerships at Brooklyn Community Foundation. Our foundation centers racial justice and equity with a practice that amplifies the expertise and fundamentally shifts power and resources to the communities we seek to serve and partner with to achieve a more fair and just Brooklyn. This practice and commitment to racial justice is something that we made in 2014 following our first Brooklyn Insights process, which is a radical listening engagement where we at that time spoke to thousands of Brooklynites in community organizations, in living rooms, in community parks, really bringing people together to understand their lived experience, their challenges and their solutions, their opportunities and their priorities. And we continue that listening practice, not only to guide how we prioritize our own resources, but also to walk step by step in that accountability partnership with community members and nonprofit organizations. In 2020, we launched, in March 2020, we launched the Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund, and over the subsequent 18 months, funded over 214 organizations across Brooklyn doing response work. Wayne, to your point, one of our first grants in March went to combat anti-Asian hate and discrimination and violence, because that was the first impact of the pandemic that we saw on our streets. But shortly after, we knew that those that are most marginalized in society would bear the brunt of the pandemic. And so we leapt into action in partnership with community organizations to address those gaps that were created by slow government response. And that is an example that is really indicative of our practice. We see our community organizations as partners. We take their lead. We really ask that they inform our work, and we collaborate with community members to do collaborative grant making. And so a lot of the things that Gregg talked about, I'm really excited to share in the panel. A lot of those practices are so core to how we work with community partners and seek to have social impact. So we'll get more into it on the panel, but thank you for having me. I'm really excited to engage in the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marcella. I want to start with a topic that Gregg brought up in his comments. He spoke a little bit about the city of Chicago as having many fewer not-for-profit and philanthropic organizations, and perhaps the difference between New York and Chicago in both cities' ability to move through this pandemic lay in the fact that the not-for-profits in New York fill a gap that quite often government and or the for-profit sector do not. I want to talk a little bit about that in the context of this kind of twin pandemic of the viral pandemic and the racial pandemic, and the question of resilience and what you're seeing in your partner organizations and community members that you work with. Let's start with Wayne on that.
That's a great question. And I think that's where we've seen some research, and everyone can look up some articles that were printed a few months ago around how are we dealing with the rise in violence in the Asian American community. And we've seen that in the Jewish communities. We've seen, obviously, police brutality against Black and Brown communities, which is institutionalized violence, not just individualized violence. But New York City and New York State contract out their responsibilities to the nonprofit sector. And there was research that was done at some of the high, quote unquote, high crime neighborhoods in Brooklyn many months ago, where instead of putting cops on the streets, nonprofits put violence interrupters, case managers, mental health professionals, social workers on the street. And we saw there was actually less violence in those neighborhoods when that was done. And I think that's where it's true. The nonprofit sector is doing the work of government oftentimes and fills the gaps. What we need is to make sure that philanthropy is not filling those funding gaps of government. Government needs to do a better job of providing living wage, faster payments, everything Gregg talked about. But we need philanthropy to jump in when there's urgent matters, when there's crises, or when there's innovation that we can do to make sure that New Yorkers and Brooklynites have a better opportunity to survive and thrive, especially during this time when we need not just relief, but also recovery.
Mm-hmm. Lisette, can you share?
Sure, I'm happy to share. I think that there are a couple of things that I think are important in thinking about where I would actually say nonprofits are doing the work, not in place of government. I actually don't think this is an area that government should necessarily be doing it. I don't know if they'd even do it as efficiently. And I'm a supporter of government, right? But I think that we noticed, particularly during the pandemic, there was one, and that was the issue of food insecurity. When you think that the complete safety net for our entire city around food pantries was related to a volunteer labor force, mostly done through small local organizations and churches that were gutted by COVID, that went from hundreds overnight to just dozens. And we saw communities, particularly communities of color, the most vulnerable communities, that were not able to access food. This was a telling display of, again, a reliance of where we should have had more of a safety net and infrastructure in a way that we didn't, right? And so that became a real priority for the fund. And that's what we support. You supported halal food pantries, which people didn't necessarily think were even something that we should have on, as we say, on the headline. I think the other thing that's kind of critical about that is food pantries are also something that are very place-based, local, and supporting that. There were many people, particularly we heard from the Asian American communities, that were not leaving their local communities for fear, for other issues as well too. And we had to make sure that food was able to get there. And we found places to do that as well too. And I'd say the other area where we actually saw where there was a gap in the nonprofits and government, not just the food pantries, was also in the arts, particularly small arts organizations and artists, right? BIPOC artists who also didn't have necessarily the supports that they could have had in a very integrated way that we were really proud to make a priority, right? And again, all of these through general operating support. But I would say that those were certain areas that I'd say COVID laid a level of clarity on that we can't go back to business as usual. We often talk about it in terms of racial, but I would say in terms of the other types of security for our arts community and for food, we have to have a better situation going forward.
Lisette, the arts are obviously very close to our heart at BRIC, and so we're certainly going to come back to that question in particular, but I wanted to move over to Marcella and see if she wanted to share anything on this topic.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things we saw, and I'll just focus in on the resilience of the nonprofit sector in response to COVID, when we launched the Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund, we had early conversations with our nonprofit partners just to kind of focus some of the initial areas of funding, but we left it wide open because, again, we knew that nonprofit organizations that were on the ground, community members that were on the ground, would be most attuned to the emerging needs in response to not just the emerging, but you know, if you think back to that time, it was very dynamic, right? There were challenges that were coming to light that people didn't necessarily expect, and nonprofits had to jump and respond. And so when we rolled out the Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund, we left funding opportunities pretty broad and just asked, what emerging need were you responding to specific to the impact of the COVID pandemic? And how are you applying a racial justice lens in your response? That is how we made those decisions. Very kind of, that is as streamlined as you can get for funding. 2 questions about what the work is. And we wound up having a pretty broad set of funding areas, but they were built organically based on what nonprofits were reporting that they were seeing in their community and the responses that they were creating really in the moment to address those emerging needs. So everything from, and Lisette is totally right, the food access issues were a serious challenge. And we saw during that period of time, those several weeks between when food ran out at home and when New York City Department of Education decided that families could pick up meals at any local public school, nonprofit organizations stood in that gap. Everything from food pantries to some of the innovative nonprofits we funded that connected, really looking at people who couldn't pick up food from a pantry and because they didn't have facilities to cook in their home, right? Or in the room they were staying in or in the shelter. And so what they were able to do was connect with local restaurants, right? And so you're funding the local restaurants by getting culturally, appropriate food to families who don't have cooking facilities, but you're still meeting that food gap. So that's the kind of just really quick and innovative thinking that we have come to expect from our community partners, because that's how they stand up. And that's part of the resilience in meeting community needs that we see from the nonprofit sector in Brooklyn.
Indeed. The food insecurity question is part and parcel of another one that I wanted to put on the table for the panel, and that is the question of increased homelessness in New York. The pandemic has forced the displacement of many people in the city to both leave New York City and to also lose their traditional housing in many ways. I'd love the panelists to talk a little bit about how you're seeing homelessness show up in your work and the work of your partners. Let's start with Lisette.
Sure, I'm happy to. So what we're seeing is a number of kind of housing advocates really coming to bear in this sector in ways that we hadn't seen in the past. I should have started with, I'm born and raised in Brooklyn via Puerto Rico, right? So I've lived in every part of Brooklyn. And I will tell you, I grew up in the 70s, and that was a time when there were people really organizing around housing and slumlords at the time. For those of us who are of that age, we remember that this was an interesting time in New York City. I'm seeing a level of housing kind of mobilization in ways I have not seen in the past. We saw that regarding legislation that's passed in the Bronx, right? We're going to see that. And so we're seeing housing advocates communicate this, but not just as housing advocates. And those are some of those that are partner organizations. We're seeing them as part of an intersectional piece for civil rights organizations. So our LGBTQ plus communities are also talking about housing needs and what's happened to communities, right? That may feel like they're being and are experiencing being forced out in ways and can't afford to stay, right? That's really important. So housing is an issue. I would say that there is another piece to it, which is what we saw during the pandemic, and we will continue to probably see, is the impact, particularly on Latino households. We cannot ignore the doubling and tripling up and how fast the virus spread through families because they were not able to socially isolate. We saw this also in Asian American families, African American families, to the point where higher levels of deaths, higher levels of hospitalizations. So that is what housing insecurity means in this city, and who disproportionately carried the brunt of that. I'm really hoping that the future of the city, whoever is our new mayor, really looks at this as a priority, because the recovery is essential. And let's not forget that, let's put this in real perspective about housing and the pandemic. Think of the tens of thousands of children who are without parents because of COVID, right? Because of the multiple families that were living together and doing that. So we also support housing advocacy as well, too. So I just want to add that to the conversation.
Indeed. Wayne.
So housing and homelessness are critical issues in the Asian American community and immigrant communities. So before the pandemic, the Asian American community had the highest rates of overcrowded housing of any racial group. So that means multiple families, multiple individuals all living in the same house in order to make ends meet. And I remember visiting tenement buildings down in Chinatown and Lower East Side, where families built planks over the kitchen so that they could live there, or 3 families living in a tiny studio. And unfortunately there were, and they're not related, so unfortunately there were physical assaults and rapes and other very, very traumatic experiences in this overcrowded housing. So we move forward to the pandemic, and this is where philanthropy, working with government and nonprofit, we saw some positive changes. Getting money out the door to nonprofit organizations so that we could keep people in their homes. So this is where a philanthropy supporting advocates, so we could fight for the eviction moratorium. And while hashtag cancel rent is a good hashtag, what the policy was making sure that both landlords as well as residents and tenants could stay. We saw that there was the Emergency Rental Assistance Program and the Excluded Workers Fund. A lot of stumbling blocks getting out the door, but government needed to rely on nonprofit organizations to make sure we could have direct financial assistance to individuals and make sure they can stay in their homes as well as put food on their tables. Just with Hurricane Ida, research came out yesterday that the vast majority of New Yorkers who died in basement apartments were Asian American, mostly South Asian. And this just shows once again that while some of the homelessness numbers in New York City have not ever fully captured the Asian American community, we do know that affordable housing and homelessness are issues that impact our communities. And that's where I'm hoping that philanthropy continues to be innovative and continues to invest in not only making sure that nonprofits who are on the ground can get financial assistance directly to communities who need it, especially undocumented and mixed status families who, because of President Trump, the public charge rule, are afraid of public benefits and any government programs, that we as nonprofits have the trust and we can do direct financial assistance and help them navigate government programs, that we also need to see government itself innovate and make sure that it can get dollars out the door to nonprofits, to communities who are struggling, especially with homelessness and other economic justice issues.
Absolutely. Education has come up, and I want us to spend some time on that because obviously the pandemic has impacted particularly children decidedly hard, given the suspensions of in-class learning for many, many months. Tell me a little bit about what your organizations are doing, both for youth education as well as for adult education, which is obviously critical for working class and immigrant communities. Let's start with Marcella.
Sure. So Brooklyn Community Foundation for, 7 or 8 years, we've had one of our largest funds. It's $2.5 million of grant funding per year under our Invest in Youth initiative. And we fund 55 organizations in general operating support, multi-year funding to address needs of young people with a special focus on youth justice, the needs of immigrant youth, and addressing needs of young people who have been impacted by the carceral system. And we see, again, innovative solutions to both school-age children and young people who are in school settings and out of school settings, where community organizations are using everything from, as Lisette mentioned, the power of the arts, arts education and arts interventions to engage young people in everything from meeting their basic needs in their day-to-day life to becoming community organizers and activists and really understanding their social condition and developing a political analysis to be change makers, not just to impact their own lives, but to better their communities. We we have that commitment, and we've had that commitment for many years. But again, we saw these same organizations step up to address the particular vulnerabilities that COVID placed on young people. Everything from providing additional mental health support for young people who are LGBTQ and kind of potentially stuck in homes that are not supportive, or street homeless youth who are disconnected from services because of changing or kind of virtually based organizational services. We had a lot of organizations that we were able to support through the COVID-19 Response Fund that stood in that gap. And then some of the basic things like making sure young people had access to virtual learning when, we were waiting for the DOE to address that virtual divide in terms of Wi-Fi access and equipment in terms of laptops and things like that. But we, and again, this came from our 2014 Brooklyn Insights process. We have long identified young people as a key population to invest in and to support. And again, that's young people that have a range of lived experiences and identities.
Mm-hmm. I want to put it on that question of access. Wayne, I know your membership spans a wide geographic area, and within China, many different dialects are spoken. How good of a job is the city doing in terms of linguistic access to many communities for whom English is not a core language of fluency?
Yeah, language access has always been one of the biggest challenges, not just for the Asian American community, but also many immigrant communities. I think the city actually did better than the state on language access. The city has language access laws and needs to make sure that there's a certain amount of translation and interpretation. I think the challenge has been that the guidance from vaccines to schools closing down to what public benefits are available to whether or not you can go to a restaurant, that these guidance were changing so quickly that we as nonprofits had to be the ones to communicate to the community. We had staff who twice a day would go on to Chinese radio for the last 19 months and interpret city and state guidance, once in Cantonese and once in Mandarin. And while we don't have funding to help with unemployment benefits or certain other government programs, when unemployment skyrocketed last year and the state of New York were opening up their phone lines, they did not have interpretation. Their website relied on Google Translate. They did not translate into any language unemployment claims. So we had hundreds of phone calls to all our community centers asking us to help them navigate the unemployment process. So language access remains a big issue for many communities in New York. And that's why we're always pushing our government partners that when you issue guidance, you need to interpret it as soon as possible.
Since you brought up vaccines, I want us to, as a group, address that. How has the policy around vaccination, specifically in New York City, the mayor's key policy, impacted your work in the field and the ability to continue your programming? Let's start with Lisette.
Yeah, I would say many of the nonprofit organizations that are in our partnership organization were what we considered the credible messengers that were getting the word out regarding vaccines. I think that was important. I think another piece that we often don't talk about is the operational back office support that was necessary. Or though they had signed government contracts, they did not have the financing to do the work. We provided more bridge financing at zero interest so that folks could actually get out there and do it in real time, right? And I think that is a critical piece that, we know banks can't offer that because we can only have a signed contract as collateral. And so when we think about the delays, what does it mean to be nimble? We have to remember that this takes time, effort, energy, and dollars. So we're really proud that we're able to do that. What we noticed, particularly with the vaccine, is a variety of things happening. we noticed that also organizations, nonprofits, had to also make sure that there wasn't levels of miseducation within their own organizations, right? What was happening there? That was important. This was very much a local conversation that had to happen. So we saw plenty of our organizations doing that. I would say something that was interesting, and it was something that Wayne had pointed out. Because many of them are partner organizations, they may not be on record as showing that they are BIPOC led. And we had significant numbers that were actually led by BIPOC leaders that were doing this work. And that is because they were able to ramp up with an idea and staffing before they were able to go through the paperwork of becoming a formal 501c3, and we were there to help support them be that way. Same kind of things, the nimbleness that I know Randy is very action-oriented and supportive of for seeing small businesses do. We need to constantly remember we need to do that too for what we think are the leaders that are trying to make work happen in this area.
Yeah.
Marcella?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to echo something Lisette just said about nonprofit organizations doing the community-focused work around prevention, testing, and prevention, including vaccinations for COVID, doing that community education, but also needing to turn that education inward to make sure that their staff have accurate information, because they are those credible messengers, they are those trusted messengers. And this spring, we committed $250,000 to our community health and outreach support grants under the Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund to support nonprofit organizations in Brooklyn doing just that. So we had 25 grantees that were committed to addressing issues related to vaccine access, to having safe spaces for people to talk about concerns or hesitancy around the vaccine, but also continuing to push messaging around masking and social distancing, and looking at all of the behavioral and biomedical interventions that will help us prevent COVID-19 spread. But I think one of the, again, important messages that I always come back to is going to those that are closest to the community to understand not just what the needs are, but the best ways to engage in those conversations, right? So we had community organizations that, again, since these are grassroots organizations, the community members that, get talked about as if they are separate from the people that work in community organizations, we understand that that is a blended group, right? A lot of the staff at our nonprofit grantee organizations live in and not just come from, but are still embedded in and members of the communities they serve, which we're really proud of and proud to support that. But those credible messengers need to be supported so that they can engage in that work to make sure that community members have access to a range of medical services and social supports to keep themselves and their families healthy. So we definitely have engaged in that work over the past year.
Wayne, I know that the fears and misinformation around the COVID-19 pandemic have had a particularly strong impact on the communities you represent. And I want you to speak a little bit about kind of where we're going as a community to reduce the anti-Asian violence in New York City, and what programs you've seen that are helping to reverse that trend.
Yeah, and I always like to remind folks that the Asian American community was the first to suffer, going back to January 2020. So 2 months before New York State went on pause, we are already hearing stories of not just the economic, but also the physical and safety challenges that our community faced. It was during the time around Lunar New Year, and New Yorkers were not going into Chinatowns or other Asian neighborhoods to take part in celebrations. If you're not supporting restaurants and small businesses and others, it impacts landlords, it impacts others in the neighborhood. So I remember walking through Canal Street where some of the street vendors were saying, hey, to tourists, hey, you want to come in and check out my products? And I remember overhearing a tourist say, no, I don't want coronavirus. And these are the microaggressions we started hearing, and then obviously moved towards safety issues. And we had seniors who lived in our affordable housing who were on priority lists to go get vaccinated and refused to get vaccinated because they were worried about their safety. we had staff members who are essential staff who did not want to go to their jobs because they were more fearful of catching a fist to their face than they were of catching COVID. And these are heartbreaking stories that our staff and our community members had to go through. And I think that's where it's great that we had so much philanthropy come to us and understand we need to address anti-Asian hate crimes and also understand that there's different ways of doing safety. So I do want to acknowledge Marcella and the Brooklyn Community Foundation because of their grant making that they shifted. We got resources not just to deal with what's going on with the pandemic and food insecurity, but we also had the opportunity to deal with anti-Asian violence. We need to partner with NYPD and law enforcement and the DA's offices to make sure we're not perpetuating a carceral system and that we can expand restorative justice. We need to make sure that there's more resources going to nonprofits on the ground so that we can be trained on violence interruption, upstander trainings, and other interventions to make sure we can de-escalate. We need to make sure that we continue to work together and stand in solidarity with other communities, Black, Brown, and other communities of color, LGBTQ, Jewish communities, to make sure that there's safety. I think I spent so much time talking to business improvement districts and chambers of commerce and others in the for-profit sector because they wanted to know if something happened in their neighborhood, what can they do? What can stores do? What can businesses do to make sure there's safety when they observe incidents? And I think it's a tough time right now for the community, but I think that we're seeing less media around it, but the fears still do exist, unfortunately.
Absolutely. So Gregg brought up an important topic in his opening statement that I want to loop back to. So over the past 24 months, the two major initiatives within philanthropic giving, I think it's fair to say, were pandemic relief and racial equity funding. We're getting to a point now where those initiatives may be at their tail end immediately. And I think Gregg also articulated the fact that quite often the funding didn't always meet the rhetoric around both of those initiatives. But if we're moving into a new phase, this is a question for the panelists to also speak to the other not-for-profits who might be watching the forum. How does an organization pivot effectively to be able to put itself in a position to receive funding for initiatives that are popular in the moment while still staying true to its core knitting and its mandate? Because the reality is you have to apply for grant funding in order to continue as a going concern. And we might be moving into a new phase. And how does an organization meet both of those needs at the same time? Let me start there with Lisette.
Yeah, so it's interesting. In conversations at the fund, we weren't as worried about 2021 fiscally. We actually think the cliff is going to be 2022 for nonprofits, right? And so what we saw, don't get me wrong, 2020 and 2021 for the arts, 2020, 2021 to retail, other areas, yes, immediately. For nonprofits, we're looking at 2022. And so what we're already seeing on the horizon is some of this money drying up. We already are, right? Or we're seeing philanthropy going back to very descriptive kinds of grants. In fact, getting away from general operating support. So there you go. That's one thing. The other thing that we're seeing is from a government response is when the government decides that a bulk of the money is going to go, particularly on youth services, through the Department of Education and not directly to nonprofits. We know that has a disproportionate impact on the smaller, very local organizations that count on this kind of funding, right? Only the larger organizations can benefit that through a vendor relationship. And this is also problematic. I want to point out, so when we're hearing that there is kind of a stimulus or support for nonprofits, who it goes through really matters, right? So I would love to urge philanthropy to really understand that piece because we have not resolved, I'll end on this, Seneca, we have not resolved or dealt with the childcare crisis that is in this country, all right? That has fallen predominantly on women and families. And so I think this is an area where nonprofits have been that solve in some ways, or the multi-generational families that Wayne's talking about have been the way that people have, but as a result of pandemic, that's become even more fractured. So I'll leave it there.
Marcella?
Yes. So what comes to mind immediately for me, particularly around racial justice funding, is it is really important that folks in the philanthropic sector understand that racial justice funding is not necessarily standalone, siloed funding. Arts funding can be racial justice funding. Funding for education can be racial justice funding, right? It's about who you're funding, what their approach is. Are they looking at root causes as well as perhaps a direct service? Um, we need to broaden our understanding, and I think one of the responsibilities of funders like Brooklyn Community Foundation that has a racial justice focus is to not just talk to community partners and nonprofit organizations about what we're doing, but we have a practice of, and we continue to encourage other funders to do that advocacy within the philanthropic sector. We talk to other funders about why they should be providing general operating support, why they should lower their threshold for entry in terms of operating annual operating budget for organizations to allow smaller Black, Indigenous, and people of color led organizations that are grassroots to have an opportunity to access their funding. We do that internal work in our sector to push that advocacy forward because it is very valuable, and it is, I think, part of the role of nonprofits to do that, but it can also feel very risky for nonprofit folks in the development area of their organization or executive directors to be advocates in that way because of a fear of being, ostracized as being too critical of philanthropy. That is a real concern. So we take it as part of our responsibility to do that sectoral advocacy. And I think the other piece of that is to make sure that in addition to focusing on educating other philanthropic institutions, it's donor education. So we are a public foundation. We have in 2020, we had 1,600 donors, many of whom were individual people, right? Small family foundations. They're not always large private or corporate foundations where we're doing this work. Educating donors on what it looks like and what it means to understand a racial justice approach in your philanthropic kind of approach is part of our work as well. And I encourage other foundations to take that on as part of their advocacy within the sector to push this forward. It's going beyond how you spend your own dollars, but how you're mobilizing other dollars and resources to these efforts as well.
And Wayne.
Yeah, I think that for my nonprofit colleagues that are on here, we at the Chinese American Planning Council, I think that we are a large social services organization, and we predominantly serve the Asian American community, but we do serve other immigrant and low income and racial groups. And what I encourage to do is that you always need to communicate not just your community's needs, but you need to communicate the work that you do and the impacts that you're making. And I think that's where, while I have a great development team, a great communications team, and a great program and operations team, the reality is that we have spent time over decades and in recent years under my leadership of making sure that we're having honest conversations with our funders, honest conversations with our government funding agencies, let them know what works and what doesn't work with their funding, what the gaps could be, and also what impacts we've been making. We had many first-time donors and family foundations and come to us during the pandemic because they happened to hear of us through our current funders or because they found us online. The Clara Lionel Foundation, Rihanna's foundation, found us online through our social media, and we got a generous grant from them. And I think that's what I want to encourage all the nonprofits here to do. I think Lisette's correct. 2022, we know it's going to be hard. Funding is drying up, but you need to stay core to your mission. We have turned down funding. We know there's issues with domestic violence. We know there's mental health issues in the community. We do not provide those services, but we've routed these funders to our partners who do deal with these issues. You also need to advocate. If you're a nonprofit, this is the time that you should join umbrella organizations, or you should mobilize your community members to make sure the city and the state is investing in your work. We got $4 million for an Asian American Recovery Fund from the city council. We got $10 million from the state for AAPI recovery. And now we need to make sure the money gets out the door.
Excellent. So I'm going to invite members watching on Zoom to put some questions into the chat, because we will go into the Q&A session in a minute. There is one question about the fund for New York City's funding model. And so I'll ask our friends from the chamber to perhaps place a link to Lisette's organization into the chat so people can research some more information about their model. The arts. So everybody here has brought up the arts in New York City. So the arts are obviously super important to us at Brick Arts Media. New York City, over the past 24 months, has either lost or significantly seen declines in approximately 2/3 of our arts and cultural organizations. During this time, many smaller arts organizations literally had to fold up and go on ice because, one, there weren't audiences, but more importantly, there was not funding for continued operations. So at Brick, we truly believe that the creative classes will be a vital part of the revitalization of the New York City economy as we emerge out of this pandemic. But I just wanted to hear from our panelists on your perspective of how the arts fit into not only the cultural fabric of our city, but the economic future of our city. And let's start with Lisette.
Sure, absolutely. When we think about New York City, we can't separate the arts. But I want to start one thing with the arts is that it also faced a major reckoning as well. Not necessarily as much around artists, but who got to own the arts, who was managing the arts, who was running the arts experience, right? And also who were the board members of arts organizations. And I actually really appreciated seeing that happening in ways we hadn't. What we saw in the arts and what we have also is we have a large nonprofit loan portfolio. And one was supporting arts organizations that needed a particular grant or loan to get to capital support so they could actually keep running. We provided small grants as well so that they could cover the PPE in order to open up, right? I think people think that there aren't costs involved with this. There are costs. In some ways, we could get the money out faster than the city could get the money out. The other thing we noticed, particularly about the arts organizations economically, is that this was the hub, the nexus for organizing, for discussions, for safety, for community engagement. And when that was pulled away, where were people to go? So I really want to say, and I would say particularly for communities, our LGBTQIA community, really important when we think about the arts as what has been a safe space, has been a space for organizing, that when that was removed as well too, you could see the kinds of isolation and extra stresses that were on people. So for us, the arts have remained a priority for us in funding. We do not do much large funding, but we're there to provide large loans if we have to, at zero or no interest, or we can also, as a way, provide support for the PPE transition and other supports for particularly artists of color.
Marcella, can you talk a little bit about the Brooklyn Foundation's approach to the arts and forward-looking perspective?
Sure. We have long supported arts and cultural organizations, and we focus on organizations that work at the intersection of art and activism, as many of our community partners have informed me. And during the pandemic, our Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund really zeroed in on supporting smaller community arts organizations that were developing artist relief funds, right, for the teaching artists and community artists that are integral to their work. Their community arts work had to shut down temporarily, and those artists still needed to be supported to meet their basic needs. And so a number of these smaller community arts organizations started artist relief funds, and we were able to support those organizations in those efforts to make sure that, we don't view our community artists and cultural workers as disposable, because they are, in fact, the ones that we rely on for community healing. And we saw a lot of that with the street mural projects and music in the streets during the pandemic. Even supporting the direct actions and protests, there was always music. There was always a presence of art to keep that drum beat, to keep that inspiration, because we need the arts so that we can envision a new future, right? That creative thinking is integral to racial justice, not just, making sure people have access to the things they need, but what are the elements of society that we want to dream up to ensure that we have the racial justice and equity that we are all discussing. So we have a strong commitment to arts and cultural organizations, and hopefully that'll only continue to grow. But it's always, a through line in all of our portfolios.
Absolutely. I want to go back to something that Lisette just brought up, because Gregg also referenced it at the top of our session, this notion of a reputational credit bank. Gregg mentioned that many in our community do not have the historical financial resources or perhaps a commercial credit history to take advantage of everything from the PPP loans to short-term financing. And I believe Lisette just mentioned that her organization has a fund that almost works as a postmodern Grameen Bank model to make microloans to local organizations based upon your reputational credit score. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Lisette?
Sure. So one thing we do is it would be part of our formal partnership program. And what we do is we have organizations that would apply to the fund who may not be 501c3s. They have an idea. And when they come as part of that, then we assume we're their fiscal agent. And then they are able to apply for different types of resources and support, because we will provide all the back office that is necessary, right? So that's one way of thinking of that, Seneca. Another way that we do it is through some of the traditional organizations that are nonprofits, but we're able to provide the bridge financing that they would not be able to get through a bank if they were given one of their first grants from government. I think we forget that most of our nonprofits in New York actually receive their first seed funding from government, not from philanthropy, right? I think this is one where, and let me tell you, that's a hard one to start funding on. It's through a government grant. It's taxing. There's a lot of work involved. And so we are there to provide that kind of intermediary support to get that money to them up front if there's a delay, right? So that would be the ways that we would be doing that I think are unique and different. In ways that we don't see in Chicago and other places, right? We don't see that. So I just want to add that there.
Wayne, can you talk a little bit about microfinancing models within the Asian American community?
Yeah, there's a lot of Asian American banks that actually started because our community members couldn't get access to capital. And that's where we see things like East Bank and other banks. But I think that's where, as we've seen with Investors Bank and others, with CRA ratings, they are doing a much better job of engaging with the community. But we also know that there's been a history of, given redlining and other issues, that CDFIs have played a big role. So Asian Americans for Equality and other nonprofit organizations have actually started their own CDFIs in order to do loans for businesses, as well as other subsidiaries that do home loans, home ownership. So I think that's where we've always seen that immigrant communities and communities of color are building their own opportunities. And I think that's where, once again, we have to start looking at the systemic issues. So for any philanthropists that are on here, I encourage them to start looking at how they can increase not just financial support to direct financial assistance to community members that are struggling, but how can they support nonprofit organizations to build more CDFIs, to do more loans and lending to businesses and homeowners and others to make sure that there is a recovery for all.
Absolutely. And Marcella, I know BCF has long invested in the notion of reputational credit. Can you talk a little bit about your approach?
Sure. So like the fund for the city of New York, we provide fiscal sponsorship to organizations that are budding organizations and not yet 501c3s. We also do a lot of brokering of relationships. So we are a community foundation that is, small to almost medium size, right? But we have a lot of credibility in our sector, and we have strong relationships with our community partners. So we leverage that in both ways to make sure that we're brokering those relationships. So our community partners have access to funders who are able to give much larger grants than we are. And by our introduction and our affirming their work and making those relationships possible, we're able to help them access greater networks of wealth and funding. So we also see that as core to our responsibility as being their community partner.
Fantastic. I want to also loop back to something that Gregg put in his opening comments. He had this wonderful nautical analogy about the difference between racial equity and racial justice. For those who weren't there, he described racial equity as we're all in a boat and we're bailing out the water to stay afloat. And then he said racial justice is patching up the holes in the boat so we can sail successfully. If this moment is that bridge time between getting the boat out of the water and to dry dock for those repairs to be done, how do we do that? Wayne, let's open with you.
I think while it's core for nonprofits to make sure we don't do mission drift, I do think that we need to be at the table. So while CPC, for example, we are a social services organization and we focused a majority of our work on direct services, under my leadership, we did start a policy and advocacy department specifically for this issue, that we need to promote racial justice. We need to promote immigrant justice as well as economic justice. And we can only do that by being at the table, dealing with systemic and structural issues, weighing in on how federal, state, and city budgets are allocated, weighing in on legislation, federal, state, and city. And that's what I encourage the nonprofits here to do, is you can stay core to your mission. And for those who do organizing, advocacy, research, services, stick to it. But we need to make sure we work more closely together. I would also encourage all the philanthropic organizations here that we need to not just fund services, we need to fund more general operating, and we need to fund more advocacy and organizing. We need to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to push and move systems.
Great. Lisette.
Yeah, so as a nonprofit for us, we feel really strong that we want to support as many ways of encouraging the kind of leadership and social entrepreneurship that exists in this city. So for us, having the partnership organization is clear. We remove barriers so that people can participate, and then thus we're able to fund directly within our partnership organization. We also feel strong that we need to continue a zero interest loan fund for those who have government contracts. Really important to get that done. The last thing I would agree is that also the general operating support. And then the fourth thing is whenever we are funding an initiative, because we have this kind of hybrid role too, is that we really ask the question too, who is this impacting, right? That's the only question who is this impacting? It should be general operating, but who is this impacting? Because I think that's an important question to remind folks of where we're at. Our niche space is smaller nonprofits that would not necessarily get the attention of larger foundations. That's where we go in particular, right? We are interested in those. That is really what I call a space that often has a gap where I think the entrepreneurial nature is, right? So in some ways, we have a small business services. We should have a small nonprofit services organization. And I feel really proud that we can kind of take the lead on that with the great leadership as well from Marcella and others, because I think that piece is important. I'll end on this, Seneca. The diversity of the nonprofit sector in New York is so broad. Is that if we don't understand the size differences and the needs, I think the one size fits all is just not going to help us. So I focus particularly on the entrepreneurial energy of those nonprofits. And I think that's an area that doesn't get enough attention.
I love that notion, Lisette, of a small not-for-profit services unit, and perhaps that could be a suggestion for the next mayor of New York City. Marcella, if you can be brief, because I want to be able to give one more question before we close out on the panel.
Okay, very briefly, do both. And Wayne was saying this, it's not, direct service versus advocacy, it's not mutually exclusive. You can fund both. Through our Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund, we funded a lot of organizations that were responding to emerging needs, immediate response, right? But we also understand that we had those emerging needs and those immediate response needs because of the structural fractures that exist in our society that marginalized people fall in every time there's a crisis. And so in July of this year, we announced $2.6 million in funding over the next 5 years to 7 organizations that are committed to organizing advocacy and real structural transformation work. So again, you have to do both if we really want to see racial justice achieved and really want to do that justice work.
Absolutely. So that nod to the mayor's office was definitely intentional. We all go to the polls on Tuesday, and in 7 weeks after that, we will have a new mayor of New York City. And also remember that about a third of the city council seats will also be new office holders as well. So it is definitely a changing of the guard on multiple levels. So I'm going to give this question to each one of our panelists. If you could make recommendations to the incoming mayor for 3 things that would strengthen the not-for-profit sector in New York City, what would those 3 things be? So I will start with Wayne.
Thank you. Only 3? Because I got many. I would say
Only
top 3.
You're only going to get 5 minutes with the new mayor, if that, and then his or her chief of staff will take it over from there.
That's what's going to happen. I would say number 1, we must pay nonprofit organizations and nonprofit workers for their work. We have been essential workers. We've been supporting the most vulnerable before the pandemic. So let's make sure there's a living wage for nonprofit contracted employees. Let's make sure the full costs of running programs are covered for nonprofits. Number 2, contracts need to be approved quickly and payments need to go out the door quickly. We saw that during the pandemic. Under executive orders, certain processes were put to the side. Contracts were approved, registered, and paid in a couple months, not in a couple years. So what can we learn from during that time to make sure that we can continue to get money and contracts out the door? That why doesn't it could happen during a crisis? Why can it not happen during normal course of business? Number 3, let's bring together a commission, a true commission with power on the nonprofit side, and it can address many things. Racial justice should be one of these issues, specifically making sure that nonprofit leaders of color and other communities are at the table when policies are made, but also making sure that we can weigh in on how services are created, how RFPs are modeled, and how we are supporting the communities most in need to make sure we can have equitable funding from New York City.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we will go to Marcella for the same setup.
Well, Wayne took all of my answers, which means that they are very important, right? Recommendations. But I do want to double down on the insistence that we pay for the work that we ask organizations to do. We have a serious issue with really having the nonprofit sector create a whole workforce of underpaid workers. And a lot of that is directly connected to how they're funded by government and public institutions and philanthropy for that matter. We ask nonprofits to do extraordinary work. We ask them to be responsive and innovative, and we really give them, we meaning New York City government, give them pennies to do that work. And so I would echo Wayne's insistence on making sure that we are paying organizations equitably, making sure that we insist and fund them in a way where they can pay at least a living wage, not a minimum wage, to their workers. Because again, we pay for it in different ways, right? When you have a nonprofit workforce that oftentimes has to rely on government subsidies because they are underpaid, yet they are overworked, that's a real structural issue in our nonprofit workforce and sector.
I fully agree with you. And the battle fatigue that I believe Kevin referenced at the top of our session today is a big part of that undercompensation and definitely needs to be highlighted throughout. Lisette.
All right. Thank you, Seneca. And thank you for Wayne and Marcella, because I would agree with those points. I'll add one here. The first one is we want to look at nonprofit contracting as well, right? In general. Love that we already streamlined some things. How do we continue to go the next step? And there's ways of building great commissions to support that. Another piece that hasn't been talked about is the idea of youth employment. I think that's really important. We can't ignore that. Early youth employment experiences are the key links to make sure there isn't a level of chronic unemployment in the future. And we keep ignoring that piece. I do not know why. It drives me insane. But that's a piece that we need to acknowledge, and that is employment in both the for-profit and nonprofit sector. The third thing is what I called youth investing in a priority of youth and childcare infrastructure. Whoever the next mayor is, we really need to see this happen. That means where we actually see both for-profit independent small business owners who are doing childcare at home, as well as nonprofit organizations who do childcare, really being funded at a level that is of a living wage and that has support, so that we can actually support families. And that's a piece that needs to have a priority. We've needed it as a priority for a while. Now we need to make sure that it's a priority. Those would be my three.
Lisette, from your mouth to Washington's ears on that last point there. Certainly, certainly. Well, I want to thank all of my panelists, Marcella, Lisette, and Wayne, for their comments and the conversation. And this is an important topic that touches everyone who lives and works in Brooklyn. So I'm going to pass now to the Chamber's President and CEO, Randy.
Well, the only thing I can say is extraordinary. When you put together a bunch of Brooklynites in Seneca, Marcella, Wayne, and Lisette, you're going to hear the real deal, folks, and you're not going to get it filtered. And that's what I appreciate most about this conversation. We touched upon so many important topics. You know, I ran, as Lisette knows, one of the largest youth workforce development organizations based in Brooklyn for 10 years. It was probably one of the most rewarding professional experiences in my life. And a lot of the struggles that the not-for-profit community goes through haven't changed much. I hate to say it. And if we really want to be true to improving the sector, then most of those recommendations, if not all, that were just put forward sort of need to come to fruition. There's just no way about that. So I do want to thank our panelists. You are all connected to the Chamber, and some of you to me personally. I'm grateful for your service. Seneca, I am grateful to you for moderating this wonderful panel. You will be joining our board of directors, and I'm grateful in advance for some of the work that you're going to do here at the Brooklyn Chamber. Marcella, you know, the Brooklyn Community Foundation really focused on philanthropy through looking at it through a social justice lens before it was popular to do so. And that's a nod to some of your predecessors and leaders, but to you and to the foundation. Wayne, you and I work closely in the same community in many respects. As you know, I was community board chair in Sunset Park for a number of years, and the Asian American community is a community I work closely with, now the Asian American business community. And Lisette, what can I say? You and I, we've worked together, we've gone to school together, our families have broken bread together. You are a true dear friend, you are an amazing leader. And I am just grateful that you were able to join us today as well. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to Investors Bank and to Anna and Kevin and Jennifer. You do this every year. I know you do this in other parts of your service area. It's such an important conversation. And if you weren't helping to sort of underwrite this and facilitate this, like, I don't know if we would be able to have these frank conversations elsewhere. So I want to thank Investors Bank once again. You know, we did 39 commercial corridors tours through the pandemic. Once again, this was before vaccination, but this was April through November of 2020. We put on our masks and we went out there and we spoke to small business owners. There's a different type of equity and justice conversation. It involves our small businesses. There is displacement of small businesses that were BIPOC owned. Mainly because of issues related to access to capital or lack thereof, and how that capital is underwritten and facilitated. We are trying to address that with the Social Justice Fund through our Brooklyn Accelerate Loan Program, which Gregg and the Social Justice Fund have alluded to and underwritten, and we are promoting. That's character-based lending, and it's really old school in many ways. It's who in the community can vouch for you, and it's a shake of the hand, and let's get moving and let's get you restarted and reintegrated into the economy. Because before the pandemic, let's not forget, small businesses were shut down because government shut them down. They were baking bread, they were cutting hair, they were running a restaurant, and they were doing it fine. Government shut them down. They just didn't have the same access to capital to get back on their feet that white-owned businesses had. So this is the area that we want to address in a lot of our work on the ground. Brooklyn Chamber's got a lot of good things happening till the end of the year. We're going to do things starting in person. We have an infrastructure breakfast on November 10th. We're going to talk infrastructure, right? So infrastructure and the conversation around employment is key. We're going to have Jano Lieber, chairman of the MTA, Carlos Asura, the president of the Building Congress, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce representative Ed Mortimer is going to talk about infrastructure and what that could mean for Brooklyn and New York City. And then our next big signature event thereafter will be our annual meeting and our holiday gala, which will be December 9th. We do a trade expo, so we're combining those two events. We're going to do it in Southeast Brooklyn at El Carib. So I would encourage you, if you can get to that event. It's a really big signature event. We've invited the governor to speak. We are inviting what will be then Mayor-elect Adams to speak. So it should be a really good and interesting event. With that, the Chamber does 4 things: promotion, support, advocacy, and convening. This is about convening, what we did here today, right? This is about bringing people together to have a conversation, sometimes uncomfortable conversations, but sometimes creative conversations about how we as a community can move forward. And small businesses are part of that conversation, and Brooklyn's economy matters to New York City, now so more than ever. As the New York Times pointed out, Brooklyn is leading the way in the economic recovery. There's a lot of reasons for that. I won't get into that now, but I would encourage you to visit brooklynchamber.com, check out our event schedule, and we do a lot of work with the not-for-profit community. Not-for-profit community are members of the Chamber. They attend our events. They lend their expertise to our work, and we are grateful to all of you throughout the not-for-profit sector for what you do for Brooklyn, for its people, and for its business community. So let's not forget that too, because they contribute to our businesses and our economy as well. With that, thank you again to our panelists, to Investors Bank. Thank you to the Chamber staff that helped put this together, Lori Rayfield. We are very, very grateful to all of our staff, amazing team, and to all of you. Once again, thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of the day.